At my wedding reception, standing under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, my husband took the microphone and proudly announced to our 300 guests that he was signing over his luxury penthouse to his mother, along with an $8,000 monthly allowance. The crowd wept. The church ladies praised him as the ultimate devoted son. I was supposed to stand there and accept my humiliation. Instead, I smiled, grabbed the microphone, and destroyed his entire world with a single sentence. If you have ever been pushed to the edge by a toxic family, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from in the comments. You are going to want to hear exactly how I made them pay. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and as I sit here on my velvet sofa sipping a glass of vintage Cabernet, I can finally appreciate the absolute silence of my home. But getting to this peace required walking through a storm of deception and arrogance. To the outside world, and more importantly, to my former husband Marcus, I was just a mid-level financial risk advisor. I wore sensible suits, worked quiet hours, and never flashed my money. It was the perfect cover. What none of them knew was that I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, a stealth private equity firm. I buy out distressed assets, liquidate bad debt, and restructure failing portfolios. My net worth sits comfortably around $40 million. Marcus thought he was marrying a quiet, obedient woman who would gladly stand in his shadow. He had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. Let us go back to that spectacular evening in Washington, D.C. The wedding was held at one of the most exclusive venues in the city. The room was dripping in white orchids and gold accents. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. Marcus wanted an event that screamed old money and prestige, and he made sure every detail reflected the flawless Coleman family brand. The guest list was a carefully curated mix of political aides, investment bankers, and the most influential members of his mother Beatrice and her mega church. To look at them, you would think the Colemans were royalty. They projected an image of absolute perfection. Marcus wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than a used car. He walked around the room with his chest puffed out, soaking up the admiration of his peers. But beneath that polished veneer, the tension was suffocating. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, held court at the head table like a queen demanding tribute. She was 60 years old, draped in expensive silk, with a designer handbag resting prominently on the table for everyone to admire. From the moment I met her, Beatrice made it her personal mission to remind me that I was not quite up to the Coleman standard. She viewed my modest job title as a mild embarrassment, something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Beside her sat Camille Marcus and his younger sister and her husband Tyler. Tyler was a mid-level sales director who worked at the same investment fund as Marcus. He was a white man who tried far too hard to fit into the wealthy black elite circles Marcus navigated. Tyler was always eager to ride my husband's coattails, constantly agreeing with every arrogant statement Marcus made and taking every opportunity to belittle me. The entire reception felt less like a celebration of our union and more like a coronation for Marcus. I sat quietly at the sweetheart table watching the dynamic unfold. I saw the way Beatrice looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and triumph. I saw Tyler whispering to Camille, pointing in my direction and smirking. They all thought they had me figured out. They thought they had trapped a nice, simple woman who would let them dictate her life. The arrogance in that room was almost thick enough to choke on. They had spent the last year treating me like a second-class citizen in my own relationship. I had endured the snide remarks about my wardrobe, the passive-aggressive comments about my salary, and the blatant disrespect from Beatrice, who constantly reminded Marcus that his wealth needed to be protected from gold diggers. Little did they know I was observing everything. I was analyzing their weaknesses, tracking their financial missteps, and quietly preparing for the moment they would inevitably cross the line. The breaking point had actually happened a week before the wedding, setting the stage for the explosive confrontation at the reception. Marcus had invited me to a lavish dinner at an upscale steakhouse. Halfway through our meal, Tyler and Camille conveniently showed up and joined us. Then Marcus slid a thick folder across the table. It was a prenuptial agreement. He did not ask for a discussion. He demanded my signature. He told me that his assets, his investments, and his future earnings needed to be completely walled off. What is mine, and what is yours, he had said with a condescending smile. Debts remain with the individual, and assets remain with the individual. Tyler had chimed in laughing as he cut his steak, telling me it was just standard procedure for high net worth individuals, and that I should not take it personally. I remember looking at the contract, reading the harsh, unforgiving clauses designed to leave me with nothing if the marriage failed. I did not cry. I did not argue. I just smiled, took out my pen, and signed on the dotted line. They thought I was surrendering. They had no idea I was locking them into a legal trap they would never escape. Back in the ballroom, the clinking of glasses brought me out of my thoughts. The music faded out as Marcus stepped up to the microphone. The room fell completely silent. The lighting shifted to illuminate him perfectly. He looked like the picture of success, holding his glass high, ready to deliver his groom speech. I watched him from my seat, maintaining a perfectly serene expression. I knew the Coleman facade was built on a mountain of lies. I knew about the secret debts, the fraudulent accounts, and the desperate attempts to maintain their wealthy image. And as he cleared his throat to speak, I knew that the perfect storm I had been brewing for months was about to make landfall. Marcus tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thud echoed across the grand ballroom, commanding the absolute attention of every senator, investment banker, and socialite in the room. He flashed that signature $1 million smile, the one he used to close deals and charm investors. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully in my lap, remembering the vows we had exchanged just a few hours earlier. Underneath a breathtaking archway of white roses, Marcus had looked into my eyes and promised to honor me, to protect our union, and to build a life where we stood as equals. It was a beautiful performance. He even managed to squeeze out a single perfect tear for the cameras. But listening to him now as he commanded the stage at our reception, I knew those vows were nothing more than a script he had memorized to look good for his audience. He began to speak, but his words were not about our love story. They were not about the promises we made or the future we were supposed to build together. Instead, his speech sounded like a quarterly earnings report wrapped in a self-congratulatory memoir. I stand before you today, not just as a groom, but as a man who has conquered his own destiny, he announced, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. I have climbed the corporate ladder at Meridian Investments. I have secured the bag. I have built an empire with my own two hands. He paced the stage, holding the microphone like a seasoned politician at a campaign rally. He painted himself as a titan of industry, a man who willed his own success into existence through sheer brilliance and unmatched grind. He did not mention the long nights I stayed up helping him format his reports, or the times I quietly fixed his risk assessment models so he would not get reprimanded by his superiors. He erased me entirely from his narrative of success. A wealthy man needs a quiet, elegant wife to sit at his table and applaud his greatness. That was the role they had assigned me. I was the polished accessory meant to complete his picture of the perfect, successful man. He directed his gaze toward the head table, specifically targeting his mother. Beatrice sat up straighter, adjusting her posture so the crystal chandeliers would perfectly catch the light on her diamond necklace. Surrounding her at the adjacent tables were the senior members of her mega church. Sister Jackson and Sister Miller were already nodding enthusiastically, fanning themselves with their custom-printed wedding programs and murmuring agreements like they were sitting in the front pews on a Sunday morning. Marcus knew exactly how to play them. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of deep artificial humility that made my stomach turn. "A man is nothing without the queen who raised him," Marcus declared, pressing a hand to his chest. He spoke about how Beatrice was the true architect of his wealth, the matriarch who sacrificed everything so her son could sit in corner offices and dictate the financial futures of the elite. He praised her resilience, her prayers, and her flawless guidance. The church ladies were practically weeping now, overwhelmed by this display of masculine success and filial devotion. Beatrice soaked it all in, looking around the room to ensure every single guest was properly admiring her son and, by extension, her. I glanced over at Tyler, my white brother-in-law, who was leaning back in his gilded chair swirling a glass of expensive scotch. Tyler was nodding with exaggerated respect, a smug grin plastered across his face. Tyler idolized Marcus. He worshipped the access Marcus provided to these exclusive high-net-worth circles, and he loved riding my husband's coattails at the investment fund. He caught my eye and raised his glass in a mock toast, his smirk communicating everything I needed to know. He was reveling in my marginalization. Beside him, Camille wiped a perfectly manicured tear from her cheek, completely captivated by her brother's performance. They were all feeding off each other in this bizarre, toxic echo chamber of vanity and greed. I took a slow sip of my ice water. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. I felt a profound, icy calm radiating through my veins. When you hold all the cards, you do not need to panic or throw a tantrum. You just wait for the right moment to play your winning hand. Marcus was building up to his grand finale. I could see it in his posture, the way he squared his shoulders and took a deep, dramatic breath. He asked the guests to raise their glasses. He looked directly at me for the first time since he took the stage, but his eyes were entirely empty. There was no love in them, only the cold calculation of a man about to secure his dominance and put his new wife in her place. "We live in a world where a man must protect his legacy," Marcus told the crowd, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "Entering a marriage is a blessing, but a true provider ensures the foundation of his bloodline is secured first and foremost." Tyler let out a loud whoop of approval, slapping the table. Camille clapped enthusiastically. Beatrice pressed her lace handkerchief to her face, her eyes gleaming with victorious anticipation. They knew exactly what was coming. This entire speech had clearly been coordinated behind my back, a public display of power designed to humiliate me and elevate Beatrice to the highest pedestal imaginable. Marcus stepped closer to the edge of the stage, soaking in the silence of the room. He was about to deliver his ultimate performance and drop the bombshell he thought would break me. I just smiled, keeping my eyes locked on his, waiting for him to light the match that would burn his entire world to the ground. Marcus projected his voice so powerfully it vibrated the crystal glasses on our table. "I am officially transferring the deed to my luxury penthouse in the heart of the capital directly into my mother's name. It is a $1.5 million property, and it now belongs entirely to the woman who deserves it most. But a house is not enough to repay a lifetime of sacrifice. Starting this month and for the rest of her life, I will be providing her with an $8,000 monthly stipend directly from my executive salary, so she never has to worry about a single bill ever again." The ballroom erupted. It was not polite applause. It was absolute pandemonium. The sheer magnitude of the disrespect disguised as ultimate filial devotion hit the room like a shockwave. I sat frozen at the sweetheart table, experiencing the moment in sharp, disjointed fragments. My mind processed the scene in rapid cuts. Cut to Marcus standing under the spotlight holding the microphone like a conquering hero, his chest heaving with arrogant pride. Cut to Beatrice practically collapsing into Camille's arms, overwhelmed by her own theatrical performance of surprise and gratitude. Cut to Tyler jumping to his feet, cheering and clapping his hands above his head, making sure everyone saw how fiercely he supported this financial flex. And then the most painful cut of all, the eyes of 300 guests slowly turning toward me. I could hear the hushed whispers rippling through the tables nearest to the stage. I could see the wives of Marcus's colleagues exchanging knowing glances behind their hands. The implication was clear to everyone in that room. Marcus was publicly declaring that his wealth, his loyalty, and his future belonged exclusively to his mother. I was just the woman wearing the white dress. I was a guest at my own wedding, entirely incidental to the Coleman family legacy. He was proudly locking away what he considered his greatest assets, ensuring I would never have access to them. Sister Jackson and Sister Miller were on their feet, waving their hands in the air and shouting praises. They openly wept, dabbing their eyes with tissue, praising Marcus as the ultimate devoted son. "Look at how he treats his mother," one of them cried out loud enough for the entire front row to hear. "Now that is a man raised right by the grace of God." Beatrice finally stood up, wiping away a perfectly manufactured tear. She walked toward the edge of the stage, reaching out to grasp Marcus's hand. The photographer rushed forward to capture the touching moment. The flashbulbs blinded me, illuminating my utter isolation. No one was looking at the bride to celebrate her. They were looking at me with suffocating pity. I was the outsider who had just been forcefully reminded of my place. According to Marcus's public display, I brought nothing to the table and therefore deserved nothing from it. I was meant to live in a house owned by my mother-in-law and survive on whatever crumbs my husband decided to spare after paying his $8,000 tribute. Marcus finally looked down at me, his expression screaming absolute victory. He thought he had completely outmaneuvered me. He had weaponized our wedding reception to solidify his dominance. He knew I could not throw a tantrum without looking like a bitter, greedy gold digger in front of Washington's elite. He knew that if I cried, I would look weak. If I screamed, I would look crazy. He had orchestrated this entire spectacle to trap me in a cage of public opinion, forcing me to swallow his disrespect with a smile. Beatrice turned her gaze toward me as the applause began to die down. She did not even try to hide the malicious triumph in her eyes. She gave me a slow, condescending nod, a silent confirmation that she had won. She was the queen, and I was merely a temporary subject in her kingdom. Tyler leaned over and clapped Marcus on the back as my husband descended the stairs to rejoin the head table. I heard Tyler say something about how smart it was to lock up the real estate before the ink on the marriage license was even dry. My hands rested on my lap, my manicured nails digging slightly into the heavy silk of my wedding gown. The humiliation was designed to break me, to make me feel entirely powerless in a room full of people who measured human worth by bank accounts and property deeds. They expected me to shrink down in my chair, to lower my eyes and accept my role as the financially dependent, obedient wife who would always come second. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They believed their own lies. They actually believed Marcus was the wealthiest person in the room. They believed the $1.5 million penthouse was an untouchable fortress of Coleman family wealth. They believed the $8,000 monthly stipend was backed by an impenetrable wall of corporate success. I did not shrink. I did not lower my eyes. I sat up perfectly straight, picking up my crystal goblet of ice water and taking a slow, deliberate sip. Let them have their applause. Let the church ladies weep their tears of joy. Let Beatrice clutch her pearls and bask in the glory of her stolen real estate. The higher they elevated themselves on this stage of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when I pulled the floor out from under them. Marcus took his seat beside me, smelling of expensive cologne and sweat from his performance. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with mock affection. "I hope you understand, honey," he whispered, so only I could hear. "A man has to take care of his true family first. It is just business." I turned to look at him, my expression completely serene. I smiled, letting the silence stretch between us for just a fraction of a second too long. I reached out and gently patted his suit jacket, feeling the rigid tension in his chest. "You are absolutely right, darling," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "A man has to take care of his true family, and business is just business." I pushed my chair back from the sweetheart table, the heavy fabric of my dress rustling against the floor. The time for sitting quietly had officially expired. I stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my custom silk gown. But before I could take a single step toward the stage, Beatrice was already there. She had glided over from the head table with the predatory grace of a woman who believed she had just won a war. Camille and Tyler trailed right behind her, forming a human wall of condescension. They looked like loyal soldiers ready to bask in the spoils of my absolute defeat. Beatrice leaned over the sweetheart table, placing both hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth. Her heavy perfume masked the delicate scent of the orchids surrounding us. The pious, tearful mother routine she had just performed for the church elders vanished instantly. In its place was a sharp, vicious smirk that contorted her perfectly made-up face. "You see, Nia," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction, but kept low enough that the other guests could not hear. The wealth of the Coleman family stays within the Coleman family. We protect our own. You might wear his ring, but you will never touch his empire. I hope you plan to budget that little risk advisor salary of yours very carefully from now on. You are going to need every penny just to keep up with our lifestyle. Do not expect Marcus to fund your existence. Tyler let out a loud, abrasive laugh that cut right through the ambient chatter of the room. He stepped forward, swirling the ice in his crystal Scotch glass, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. You have to hand it to Marcus, Tyler sneered, projecting his voice so the surrounding tables could catch every humiliating word. The man is an absolute genius. I told him he needed to lock his assets down before putting a ring on it, and he actually pulled it off. Tyler took a gulp of his drink and pointed an accusing finger at me. That prenuptial agreement he made you sign last Tuesday is a masterpiece of legal warfare. What is mine, and what is yours. Those were the exact words, right, Nia? No spousal support, no division of premarital assets, no claim to his investment portfolios or his real estate. He completely boxed you out. I bet that independent woman facade is cracking right about now. It must really sting knowing you just married a man worth millions and you do not have legal access to a single dime. Camille chimed in, linking her arm possessively through Tyler's. Oh, let her be, Tyler. She should just be grateful Marcus chose her to be his wife. Not many women get to sit at a table this expensive, even if they are paying for their own meals from now on. Marcus gave her the wedding of her dreams. She should be thanking us instead of looking so sour. The room seemed to spin slowly around me, a dizzying blur of gold decorations, flashing cameras, and the suffocating arrogance of the people standing directly in front of me. I let my gaze drift in a slow, deliberate arc from Beatrice's victorious smirk to Camille's mocking pity, and finally to Tyler's red-flushed face. They were so utterly convinced of their own superiority. They were so certain they had backed me into a corner, forcing me to swallow their profound disrespect while smiling for the wedding photographer. They thought the prenup was my prison. They thought the contract Marcus slid across the table at that upscale steakhouse was his ultimate shield against my supposed greed. Tyler was practically vibrating with pride, thinking he and Marcus had outsmarted me with a piece of paper. He had absolutely no idea that very piece of paper was the exact weapon I needed to ensure Marcus would drown in his own financial ruin without dragging me down with him. The ruthless clauses Marcus had demanded, the ones designed to leave me destitute, were the very chains that would bind him to his own destruction. It took every ounce of my willpower not to laugh right in their faces. They were bragging about a lifestyle built on quicksand and credit cards, while I secretly held the power to destroy everything they valued. Tyler's arrogant assumption that I was a broke risk advisor desperate for Marcus's cash was the most delicious irony of the entire evening. My net worth was $40 million. I could have bought the entire Meridian investment fund and fired Marcus on a random Tuesday just for fun. But letting them expose their true colors on this public stage was so much better. I looked at Beatrice, who was still waiting for me to break. She wanted tears. She wanted a tremor in my voice, or a flash of devastation in my eyes. She wanted me to beg for a place in their elite circle. I refused to give her a single drop of satisfaction. "You are so right, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice perfectly pleasant and projecting it just loud enough for the nearby church ladies to hear. "Family wealth must absolutely be protected at all costs." I turned my gaze to my brother-in-law, locking eyes with him until his smirk faltered slightly. "And Tyler," I added, my tone bright and conversational. I could not agree more about the prenuptial agreement. It really is a masterpiece of legal protection. What is mine is strictly mine, and what belongs to Marcus is entirely his own problem. I stepped around the sweetheart table, bypassing their shocked expressions. I did not look back as I walked purposefully toward the stage, where the microphone was still resting on its stand. The time for whispering in the shadows was over. The heavy silk of my gown rustled softly against the polished marble floor as I closed the distance between the sweetheart table and the stage. Every eye in the ballroom tracked my movement. The whispering that had filled the air moments ago died down into an expectant, heavy silence. I kept my chin high and my gaze locked dead ahead. I did not look at the church ladies. I did not look at the elite investment bankers. I only looked at Marcus. He stood near the center of the stage, his posture radiating a mix of confusion and lingering arrogance. He watched me approach with a slight furrow in his brow, clearly trying to calculate my next move. He probably expected me to come up and play the dutiful, embarrassed wife. He probably thought I was going to thank his mother through gritted teeth just to save face in front of Washington high society. I ascended the 3 carpeted steps with deliberate grace. The spotlight caught the subtle beadwork on my bodice, making it shimmer like armor. Marcus shifted his weight, leaning down slightly as I approached. He held out his hand, offering a patronizing smile designed for the cameras. "You are doing the right thing," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the room. "Just smile and tell everyone how grateful we are for my mother. Do not embarrass yourself, Nia." I did not take his extended hand. Instead, I reached directly for the microphone he was holding in his other hand. My fingers wrapped around the cool metal casing. For a fraction of a second, he resisted, his grip tightening slightly, as a flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. But he was trapped by his own audience. He could not wrestle his new bride for a microphone without shattering the perfect gentleman illusion he had just spent 20 minutes building. He let go. I turned to face the sea of guests. 300 faces stared back at me, illuminated by the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers. The silence was absolute. I took a deep breath, letting the pristine, filtered air of the luxury venue fill my lungs. I let a warm, radiant smile spread across my face. It was not a forced smile. It was the genuine, blinding smile of a woman who was about to execute a flawless checkmate. "What a beautiful speech," I began, my voice carrying crisp and clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate our union. It truly warms my heart to see so many esteemed colleagues, family members, and friends gathered in one room. And Marcus, what a profound display of generosity. Taking care of family is indeed the ultimate measure of a man." I paused, letting the words settle. I saw Beatrice at the head table puffing out her chest, taking my words as a submission. Tyler nudged Camille, looking incredibly pleased with himself. In fact, I continued pacing slowly across the stage, my tone remaining conversational and bright. "We have been so focused on protecting family wealth that Marcus and I took very specific legal steps to ensure our financial futures were secure. As Tyler so helpfully pointed out to our table just a few moments ago, Marcus and I signed a prenuptial agreement this past week." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "You do not usually mention prenups during a wedding toast. It is considered taboo, especially among the elite who prefer to keep their financial maneuvering behind closed doors." Marcus shifted uncomfortably behind me. I could feel the heat radiating from his rigid body. "Nia, what are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, stepping slightly closer. I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes on the audience. "It is a very modern, very thorough contract," I told the crowd, my smile never wavering. "Marcus is a brilliant financial director, and he wanted to make absolutely certain that we entered this marriage with crystal clear boundaries. The core clause of our agreement is very simple. What is mine, and what is his is his." I looked directly at Tyler, who was suddenly sitting very still, his smirk frozen on his face. I gave him a polite, appreciative nod. Tyler was right to praise it. The contract explicitly states that there will be no commingling of assets whatsoever. All premarital property remains the sole possession of the original owner. But more importantly, it dictates that any and all debts, liabilities, and financial obligations incurred before the marriage remain the sole and exclusive responsibility of the individual who incurred them. There is no shared burden. If one of us faces financial ruin, the other is completely legally shielded. The room was dead silent now. The church ladies had stopped fanning themselves. The investment bankers were sitting up straighter. their professional instincts suddenly kicking in as they recognized the precise legal language I was using. They knew a setup when they heard one. Marcus grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging into my skin. "Give me the mic," he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "You are making a fool of yourself. Stop talking right now." I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of his grasp, turning my body just enough to face him while keeping the microphone positioned perfectly. I was not going to stop. I was just getting started. "I think it is a brilliant strategy," I said, looking deep into his panicked eyes, then turning my gaze directly to Beatrice. "It protects the Coleman legacy exactly as it should be protected." Marcus wanted to ensure that my modest salary as a risk advisor would never touch his grand empire. He wanted to make sure that I could never claim a single square foot of his luxury penthouse or a single dollar of his executive compensation. And I am standing here tonight in front of God and all of Washington to say that I agree with him completely. I agree to the terms. I embrace the boundaries. Every asset and every crushing, devastating debt remains exactly where it belongs. I lowered the microphone slightly, letting the sheer weight of my statement hang in the air. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted entirely. The celebratory warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping tension. They did not know the details yet, but the smartest people in the room could already feel the impending drop. I turned my attention back to my mother-in-law, locking eyes with the woman who had just tried to publicly erase me. I let a smile spread across my face, a sharp, calculating expression that I had perfected over years of navigating hostile boardrooms and dismantling arrogant executives. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, reducing the physical distance between myself and the head table. Beatrice was looking up at me, and for the first time tonight, her mask of aristocratic superiority was slipping. The diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the light, trembling ever so slightly as her breathing grew shallow. She could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The predatory instinct that had allowed her to manipulate her family for decades was suddenly warning her that she was no longer the apex predator in the room. "Mother Beatrice," I said, my voice projecting a deceptive warmth that echoed perfectly through the silent ballroom. "You must be so incredibly proud. Your son just stood up here in front of the most powerful people in Washington and offered you the crown jewel of his portfolio, a $1.5 million penthouse in the sky. It is the ultimate gesture of a devoted son providing for his matriarch. But I have to ask you a very simple question." I tilted my head, leaning into the microphone. "Do you really want that penthouse?" Beatrice stiffened. Her eyes darted left and right, assessing the crowd before locking back onto me. Her jaw tightened as she forced a polite, patronizing laugh, attempting to brush off my question as the rambling of a confused bride. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Nia." She called out, her voice tight and brittle. "Marcus is giving me the deed to his home. It is a blessing." "A blessing," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue. "Let us talk about this blessing. Let us talk about the magnificent property Marcus has been using to host your elite church council meetings and high society cocktail parties." I turned slightly to include the rest of the audience in the conversation, but my focus remained laser-locked on the Coleman family. The penthouse is truly spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Potomac River, imported Italian marble in the foyer, a private elevator that opens directly into the living room. Marcus loves that elevator. He loves to tell his colleagues that ascending to his home feels like rising above the rest of the city. He loves the image of wealth it projects to everyone who visits. Marcus stepped toward me, his face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "Nia, shut your mouth," he commanded, his voice a harsh, guttural hiss. "You are having an episode. Give me the microphone right now before you do something you can never undo." I gracefully sidestepped his advance, pivoting so that my back was to him and my face was fully illuminated by the stage lights. I was completely untouchable, and he knew it. If he laid a hand on me in front of 300 witnesses, including his corporate superiors and his mother's entire congregation, his career and social standing would be instantly incinerated. He was paralyzed by the very audience he had assembled to worship him. The problem with projecting an image of wealth is that it is incredibly expensive to maintain. I continued, my tone steady and analytical. When Marcus bought that penthouse 4 years ago, he leveraged himself to the absolute limit. He took out a massive mortgage assuming his annual bonuses would cover the exorbitant monthly payments. And for the first year they did. He played the part of the young, successful titan of industry perfectly. I looked down at Tyler, who was no longer leaning back in his gilded chair. He was sitting bolt upright, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of the table. The smug smirk had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a creeping dawn of realization. As a fellow finance professional, Tyler knew exactly where this was going. But maintaining the Coleman family brand requires constant capital, I said, pacing slowly back toward the center of the stage. There are country club memberships to renew. There are designer wardrobes to update so Beatrice can maintain her status among her peers. There are luxury car leases to pay. There are lavish vacations to fund so Camille and Tyler can post the perfect aesthetic on social media. The money had to come from somewhere, and when Marcus's bonuses started drying up due to poor market performance, he had to make some difficult financial choices. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning vents. The tension was absolute. The elite crowd of Washington insiders recognized the anatomy of a financial collapse when they heard it. They had seen it happen to their colleagues and rivals. The whispers had stopped completely. Everyone was hanging on my every word. He chose to stop paying the mortgage, I announced, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. For 36 consecutive months, Marcus has not made a single payment on his magnificent $1.5 million premarital asset. Not one dime. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Sister Jackson dropped her custom-printed wedding program onto her plate. Several investment bankers sitting near the back of the room subtly pulled out their smartphones, undoubtedly pulling up public property records to verify my claims. "That is a lie!" Beatrice shrieked, standing up so fast her chair scraped violently against the floor. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me. "My son is a senior director. He makes $500,000 a year. You are a bitter, jealous liar trying to ruin his name because he protected his money from you." "I am a risk advisor, Beatrice," I replied calmly, looking down at her frantic display. "My entire career is built on verifying data and exposing financial liabilities. I do not lie about numbers. The numbers are a matter of public record for anyone who knows where to look. The bank issued the first notice of default 2.5 years ago. Since then, they have issued 3 more. Marcus managed to stall the proceedings through endless legal maneuvering and filing endless extensions, but the grace period ran out a long time ago." I turned to look at Marcus, who was staring at me with a look of unadulterated horror. His chest was heaving, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple, tracking through his expensive cologne. He was watching the flawless facade he had spent his entire adult life building shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "You see, Beatrice," I said, redirecting my attention to the head table, "your son is not giving you an asset. He is attempting to dump a catastrophic liability directly into your lap. The penthouse is currently buried under hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid interest, late fees, and severe municipal tax liens. The property is completely underwater. By transferring the deed to you, he was hoping to legally shield himself from the fallout and perhaps use your pristine credit history to refinance the toxic debt. He was not honoring you as a matriarch. He was using you as a financial human shield." Camille turned to her brother, her eyes wide with shock. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet room. "Marcus, is this true? Tell her she is lying." Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his sister, then at his mother, and finally at the hundreds of guests who were staring at him with a mixture of shocked disgust and pity. The golden boy of the Coleman family was standing naked in the spotlight, stripped of his wealth, his status, and his dignity. "It gets better," I said, ensuring the microphone captured every nuance of my voice. "The bank finally grew tired of Marcus's games. They realized he was never going to pay the arrears. 6 months ago, they initiated the final stages of a hostile foreclosure. They did not just want to evict him. They wanted to liquidate the asset to recover whatever fraction of their capital they could salvage. They packaged his toxic mortgage along with a portfolio of other distressed properties and sold it off to the highest bidder at a private corporate auction. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage, looking directly into Beatrice's wide, terrified eyes. The haughty matriarch who had spent the last year treating me like dirt on the bottom of her designer shoes was now trembling visibly. So when Marcus proudly stood up here and told you he was giving you the deed to his penthouse, he was making a promise he had no legal right to keep. I said, my tone dropping into a deadly serious register. He does not own that property anymore. The bank does not even own that property anymore. The deed belongs to the private equity firm that bought out his debt at auction. You are not receiving a luxury piece of real estate today, Beatrice. You are receiving nothing. The devastation on the faces of the Coleman family was absolute. The illusion of their superiority had been systematically dismantled in front of the exact audience they cared about most. But the true masterpiece of this confrontation was still yet to come. I had exposed the lie of the penthouse, but I had not yet revealed who was actually holding the keys. I smiled, taking a deep breath of the electrified air, preparing to deliver the next devastating blow. I took a step back, allowing the sheer magnitude of the silence to expand and fill every corner of the magnificent ballroom. If you were looking at the scene from the balconies above, you would see a perfect still life of absolute devastation. 300 of Washington's most powerful political aides, investment bankers, and religious elites were frozen in their seats. Nobody dared to take a sip of champagne. Nobody dared to whisper. They were all entirely captivated by the public execution of the Coleman family ego. I looked at Marcus. He was trembling now. The confident swagger that had carried him up to the stage was completely gone, replaced by the panicked, erratic breathing of a cornered animal. He knew his property had been sold at auction. He knew he was drowning in debt. But he had been arrogant enough to believe he could keep his financial ruin a secret because he had signed a strict non-disclosure agreement with the private equity firm that bailed him out. He thought he could just drag out the lease, buy himself some time, and use my pristine credit to somehow claw his way back to the top after we were married. Tell them the name of the company, Marcus. I challenged, my voice echoing through the massive room. Tell your esteemed colleagues and your devoted mother the name of the faceless corporate entity that currently holds the deed to your home. He clenched his jaw, refusing to speak. His eyes darted toward the exit like he was calculating the distance to the doors. Fine, I will tell them. I continued pacing slowly across the polished stage. The property was acquired by Vanguard Holdings. They are a highly specialized stealth private equity firm. They do not advertise their acquisitions, and they do not boast about their portfolio. They quietly purchase distressed, high-value real estate from desperate individuals who care more about maintaining their wealthy image than managing their actual finances. I looked down at the investment bankers in the audience. A few of them nodded slowly, recognizing the firm by reputation. Vanguard Holdings was known in the financial district as a ruthless, highly efficient machine. When Vanguard bought out his toxic mortgage, Marcus was terrified of the social fallout, I explained, projecting my voice so it reached the very back of the room. He could not bear the thought of packing his bags and moving out of his luxury high-rise. He could not stand the idea of his colleagues finding out he had failed. So he begged the firm for an arrangement. Vanguard Holdings allowed him to stay in the penthouse, but only under a strict residential lease agreement. He went from being a proud homeowner to a desperate renter in the span of a single afternoon. He has been paying rent to live in his own former home just to keep up appearances for all of you. Beatrice clutched the edge of the sweetheart table, her knuckles turning completely white. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw breath. "You are lying," she gasped out, though her voice lacked any of its previous authority. "You are just a risk advisor. How could you possibly know the confidential details of a private equity buyout?" I stopped pacing and stood dead center on the stage, directly under the brilliant glow of the chandelier. "Because, Beatrice, I know exactly who owns Vanguard Holdings," I stated, my tone dropping into a register of absolute, unshakable power. "I know exactly who analyzes the risk profiles, who approves the aggressive acquisitions, and who signs the final corporate directives. I know because I founded the company. I am the Chief Executive Officer and sole owner of Vanguard Holdings. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Gasps rippled across the room. A wine glass shattered on the floor somewhere near the back. Tyler, who had been leaning forward in his chair, physically recoiled, as if I had struck him across the face. His jaw dropped, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and profound shock. The woman he had spent the last year insulting, the woman he had just mocked for being a broke, dependent bride, was actually the apex predator of their entire industry. My personal net worth sat comfortably around $40 million. I had built an empire completely under the radar, while these men exhausted their credit lines, trying to look rich on social media. Marcus stumbled, taking a half step backward. His face was devoid of all color. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine and had already heard the click. He stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. You are Vanguard! I gave him a slow, merciless smile. I am the faceless corporate entity you begged for a lease extension last October, Marcus. I read your desperate emails requesting leniency. I approved the temporary hold on your eviction proceedings because I was curious to see just how far you would go to maintain your miserable illusion of wealth. I played the part of the modest, quiet risk advisor because it allowed me to see exactly who you and your family really are when you think you hold all the power. I turned my attention back to the matriarch of the Coleman family. Beatrice looked physically ill. The proud, arrogant woman who had strutted around the reception demanding respect was now shrinking into her chair. So let us clarify exactly what is happening here tonight, I announced, addressing the entire ballroom, but keeping my eyes locked on Beatrice. Your son is not transferring a $1.5 million asset to you today. He cannot transfer a deed he does not possess. What he is actually attempting to do is illegally transfer his lease agreement to his mother. He is trying to make you the primary tenant of a Vanguard Holdings property. I paused, letting the sheer absurdity of his grand gesture sink into the minds of the guests. But there is a massive problem with that generous gift, I continued. Marcus is currently 4 months behind on his rent payments to my company. He is in flagrant violation of his lease terms. I reached into the hidden seam of my custom silk wedding gown. My fingers wrapped around a crisp, thick legal envelope I had tucked away before walking down the aisle. I pulled it out, holding it high for everyone to see. The white paper caught the light, serving as a physical manifestation of their absolute ruin. I walked down the 3 carpeted steps of the stage. The crowd parted for me, instinctively stepping back as I moved gracefully across the dance floor. The elite guests of Washington, D.C. watched in stunned fascination as I approached the head table. I stopped directly in front of Beatrice. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with unadulterated fear. I dropped the envelope onto the table right next to her fake designer handbag. That is not a deed, Beatrice, I said, my voice soft but slicing through the silence like a scalpel. That is a formal 30-day notice to vacate. Your son is not gifting you a luxury penthouse. He is gifting you his debt, his catastrophic failure, and his impending homelessness. I am serving you with an eviction notice at my own wedding reception. Beatrice stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. She raised a shaking hand, pressing her fingers to her mouth. A choked, humiliated sob escaped her throat. The church ladies, who had been weeping tears of joy just 10 minutes earlier, were now staring at their beloved matriarch with expressions of profound pity and embarrassment. The grand illusion of the Coleman family had been completely eviscerated. Tyler jumped to his feet, his face flushed dark red. He pointed a shaking finger at me, desperately trying to salvage his own proximity to power. You cannot do this, he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. You just married him. As his wife, you cannot legally evict his mother. That is marital property now. I turned my head slowly, fixing Tyler with a gaze so cold it made him take a step back. Tyler, did you already forget the beautiful, brilliant prenuptial agreement you praised just moments ago? I asked, tilting my head in mock confusion. The masterpiece of legal warfare Marcus forced me to sign. What is mine is mine. What is his is his. Vanguard Holdings is a premarital asset that belongs entirely to me. Marcus's tenant debt is a premarital liability that belongs entirely to him. I am completely legally shielded from his financial incompetence. Thanks to his own greed, he ensured that I have the absolute legal authority to kick him and his mother out onto the street without a single ounce of marital complication. Tyler's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization of the trap they had built for themselves crashed down upon him. He looked at Marcus, who was still standing paralyzed on the stage, then looked down at Camille, who was weeping into her hands. They had demanded a contract that isolated their liabilities, and in doing so, they had handed me the perfect weapon to destroy them, without risking a single penny of my own fortune. Marcus finally moved. He practically fell down the stage steps, rushing toward me with his hands outstretched, pleading. "Naya, please," he begged, his voice stripped of all its former bass and authority. "Please, you cannot do this in front of everyone. We can fix this. I am your husband. We can work this out at home. Do not do this to my mother." He was crying now, real desperate tears tracking through the expensive makeup the groom stylist had applied. The titan of industry, the man who had just demanded total submission from his new wife, was groveling on the ballroom floor in front of hundreds of his peers. I looked down at the man I had married just hours ago. The brilliant corporate director was gone. In his place was a pathetic hollow shell of a man kneeling on imported marble and begging for mercy he had never once shown me. I did not reach out to comfort him. I did not offer a hand to help him up. I simply stepped around him, adjusting the train of my dress so it would not brush against his tear-stained tuxedo. Beatrice, however, was not ready to surrender. Panic makes people unpredictable, but narcissists only know one defense mechanism, and that is attack. She slammed her hand against the sweetheart table, knocking over a crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered, spilling expensive liquor across the white linen, but she ignored it entirely. "Lies," she screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "These are the delusional lies of a bitter woman. You expect us to believe that you own a private equity firm. You are a risk advisor. You make spreadsheets. You are a nobody trying to tear down a dynasty." She turned to the crowd, gesturing wildly toward her church friends and the confused investment bankers. "Do not listen to a word she says. The Coleman family has been a pillar of Washington society for decades. We have generational wealth she could only dream of possessing. She is making this all up to humiliate my son because she is jealous of our bond." Camille immediately flanked her mother, her face contorted with rage. She stepped forward, positioning herself as the loyal defender of the family brand. "You are just jealous," Camille yelled, her voice echoing shrilly across the ballroom. "You have always been jealous of us, Naya. You saw our lifestyle and you wanted it for yourself, but you will never be one of us. My mother comes from a lineage of prestige. Look at her. Look at how she carries herself." Camille grabbed the designer handbag resting on the sweetheart table, holding it up high in the air like a holy relic for the entire room to worship. "This is an Hermes Birkin. Do you even know how much this costs, Nia? My brother bought this for her 60th birthday with straight cash, because that is the kind of money we have. You are a fraud trying to ruin our family because you know you do not belong in our tax bracket." I let out a sharp, bright laugh. It was a genuine sound of pure, absolute amusement that cut right through their hysterical screaming. I raised my hand, making a slow, dismissive waving gesture toward the bag Camille was clutching so desperately. "Oh, Camille," I said, my tone dripping with profound pity. "Please put that bag down before you embarrass yourself any further." I took a deliberate, measured step forward, closing the physical distance between us. The energy in the room compressed. The guests were holding their breath, watching the complete unraveling of Washington's finest. "I know exactly how much that Birkin costs, Beatrice," I said, shifting my gaze back to the matriarch. "It cost $32,450 after taxes. I know the exact dollar amount because it was charged to my personal Black American Express card last October." The color completely vanished from Camille's face. Her mouth fell open and she slowly lowered the bag to the table, as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. Beatrice staggered back a step, her hand flying to her chest. "Marcus wanted to give you the ultimate birthday gift to maintain his image as the perfect wealthy son. I explained, projecting my voice to ensure the church ladies in the front row heard every single agonizing detail. But all of his credit cards were completely maxed out. His checking accounts were overdrawn. He could not even secure a personal loan because his credit score was utterly destroyed by the penthouse foreclosure. So while I was sleeping in our shared apartment, your perfect son went into my purse and borrowed my credit card. I looked down at Marcus, who was still crumpled on the floor, burying his face in his hands. He bought the bag and begged me not to press fraud charges. The next morning, I continued my words, striking them like physical blows. He cried just like he is crying now. He promised he would pay me back with his next executive bonus, a bonus that never materialized because his performance at Meridian was already tanking. That bag you parade around church every Sunday, Beatrice, does not represent your son's wealth. It represents his desperation. It represents my money. Liar, Beatrice gasped, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of her chair. You are a liar. I flicked my wrist, waving away her denial. Your entire life is a subsidized illusion, Beatrice. You sit in the front pew acting like royalty, but your exclusive country club membership was suspended 3 months ago for non-payment. I know because the club manager called Marcus while we were at dinner and I answered the phone. He begged for a payment plan just to keep your name on the roster. I turned my fierce gaze back to Camille, who was now physically shaking beside her mother. And you, Camille. You love to brag about your flawless lifestyle on social media. But that massive 5-bedroom estate you and Tyler live in is currently under a second mortgage with an adjustable interest rate that you can no longer afford. Tyler has been taking cash advances from high-interest predatory lenders just to cover your monthly landscaping bills, so your neighbors do not realize you are broke. Tyler leaped up from his chair, his face a mask of panicked rage, but I did not give him a chance to speak. I raised my voice, commanding the absolute authority of the room. When you work in risk assessment, you learn to investigate every potential liability, I announced, turning slowly to address the entire ballroom. Before I married into this family, I ran a full comprehensive financial background check on every single one of you. I had my team at Vanguard pull every public record, every lien, and every credit report associated with the Coleman name. I looked back at the terrified family standing before me. The Coleman family wealth is nothing but a magnificent house of cards built on predatory loans, staggering credit card debt, and desperate lies. You have absolutely nothing. You own nothing. The only real money in this room right now belongs to me. The silence following my declaration hung heavy, thick enough to suffocate the remaining pride out of the Coleman family. For a few agonizing seconds, no one dared to breathe. Then the sheer weight of his public emasculation finally broke something deep inside Marcus. The weeping, groveling man on the marble floor vanished instantly, replaced by a cornered, desperate narcissist fighting for his very survival. He scrambled to his feet, his custom tuxedo jacket wrinkled and stained with tears. He lunged toward the backup microphone resting on the DJ booth, his hands shaking so violently he nearly knocked over a heavy speaker stand. He gripped the mic, his knuckles turning white, and whipped around to face me. The panic in his eyes had mutated into blind, toxic rage. Do not listen to a single word this bitter woman says. Marcus roared, his voice cracking through the sound system, harsh and abrasive against the elegant backdrop of our wedding reception. She is a liar. She is nothing but a jealous, low-level advisor who cannot handle the reality of being married to a man who out-earns her, outshines her, and outclasses her in every single metric that matters in this city. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, it would be circling me in a slow, continuous arc, framing my absolute serene stillness against the chaotic, flailing desperation of my husband. As the imaginary lens moved around the intricate beadwork of my silk gown, it would catch the frantic, sweat-drenched face of Marcus in the background, a man actively digging his own grave with a microphone. He pointed a trembling finger at me, pacing the edge of the dance floor like a feral animal trying to defend its shrinking territory. You think you can come in here and humiliate me? Humiliate my mother? You think your little boutique real estate firm makes you a titan? You buy distressed properties. You are a glorified debt collector. I am a senior director at Meridian Investments. Do you hear me, Meridian Investments? The name drop was entirely intentional. Meridian was a powerhouse in Washington, a massive institutional fund that commanded absolute respect. Marcus was wielding his corporate title like a physical shield, praying the brand name alone would restore his shattered credibility in front of the political aides and bankers watching his meltdown. He locked eyes with a few of his colleagues sitting near the center of the room, silently begging them for validation. I manage billions of dollars in client assets, Marcus shouted, his chest heaving as he marched closer to my position. My base salary alone is $500,000 a year, $500,000 guaranteed before I even touch my performance bonuses. You want to talk about rent. You want to talk about credit cards. That is pocket change. $8,000 a month to retire my mother is nothing to me. It is petty cash. I wipe my hands with that kind of money. Tyler, sensing a lifeline to save his own sinking reputation, jumped out of his chair. He grabbed his glass of scotch, his face flushed with renewed, arrogant confidence. Tell her, Marcus. Remind her who runs this town. We are Meridian. We move markets while she pushes paperwork. Tyler yelled to the crowd, trying to rally the investment bankers in the room to back up their corporate brothers. Marcus fed off Tyler's desperate validation. He turned back to the crowd, extending his arms as if to embrace them. This woman signed a prenuptial agreement because I forced her to. I protected my $500,000 salary from her greedy hands, and now she is standing up here throwing a tantrum because she knows she will never get a piece of it. She went digging through my mother's purse and pulled my credit reports because she is obsessed with my wealth. She wants to be me, but she will only ever be a footnote in the Coleman family legacy. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I simply stood my ground, allowing him to scream his fabricated financial security into the vaulted ceiling. When you are about to drop the guillotine, you let the condemned man place his own head on the block. He was so incredibly eager to remind everyone exactly how much money he thought he made. He was practically begging the audience to worship his $500,000 salary, completely oblivious to the fact that his career was already a corpse waiting to be buried. You think an eviction notice scares me? Marcus sneered, stepping within 3 feet of me, his breath hot and ragged. I will write you a check for your missing rent right now. I will buy that penthouse from your little stealth company in cash by the end of the quarter. Meridian rewards its top producers, and I am the best they have. I am untouchable in this industry, Nia. Untouchable. You tried to play a high-stakes game, but you forgot who you were dealing with. I am Marcus Coleman. I am the director of Meridian Investments, and you are just my bitter, financially inferior wife. The delusion was staggering. He was clinging to his job title because it was the only piece of his identity that had not yet been stripped away. Beatrice, who had been weeping into her hands just moments ago, slowly lifted her head. A glimmer of desperate, pathetic hope returned to her eyes. She heard her son shouting about his $500,000 salary and instantly latched onto it, believing that as long as Marcus had Meridian, the Coleman family could survive this public humiliation. She even managed to straighten her posture, glaring at me as if Marcus's rant had somehow invalidated everything I had just exposed. She honestly believed his corporate status was a magic wand that would erase the eviction notice sitting on her table. Let her talk her nonsense, Marcus said, lowering his voice slightly to address his mother directly, though the microphone still caught every word. She can keep her little real estate company. We do not need it. I will buy you a better house, Mom. A bigger house. I have the entire backing of Meridian behind me. We are too big to fail. I let his final words echo through the ballroom, washing over the silent, staring crowd. Some of the guests looked genuinely uncertain, swayed by the sheer volume and conviction of his corporate boasting. Others, specifically the senior finance executives, were squinting at him, their professional instincts warning them that a man who screams about his salary at his own wedding reception is usually hiding a massive deficit. Untouchable, I mouthed silently, tasting the absolute irony of his chosen vocabulary. I looked at Marcus, his chest puffed out, his jaw set in a rigid line of toxic defiance. He had played his last possible card. He had wagered his entire existence on a corporate title and a salary that he believed elevated him above the laws of consequence. He truly thought the name Meridian Investments was a fortress that I could not breach. It was time to show him what real corporate power looked like. I remained perfectly still, allowing his desperate declarations of invincibility to fade into the heavy air of the ballroom. I did not need to raise my voice or match his frantic energy. I just looked down at him. If a camera were placed at the base of the stage, it would capture my posture as a towering monument of absolute control, casting a long shadow over the man sweating under the hot lights. I held the high ground. He was standing in a valley of his own creation, completely unaware of the flood that was about to wash him away. I turned my head slightly away from Marcus and looked directly across the dance floor toward the elevated DJ booth. The DJ, a professional I had personally vetted and hired, gave me a quick, subtle nod. I raised my hand and simply snapped my fingers. The transition was instantaneous. Behind Marcus, the massive 20-foot digital projection screen spanning the entire back wall of the stage flickered. For the past 4 hours, that screen had displayed an elegant looping animation of our wedding monogram. A beautiful swirling gold M and N intertwined over a backdrop of falling white rose petals. It was the ultimate symbol of the perfect Washington power couple. With a sharp electronic click, the gold monogram vanished. The ballroom was suddenly bathed in a harsh, blinding white light radiating from the screen. The romantic ambiance of the reception was completely shattered, replaced by the sterile, glaring aesthetic of a corporate boardroom. The guests shielded their eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness. Marcus jumped, startled by the shift in lighting, but he refused to turn around. He kept his eyes locked on me, his chest still heaving from his aggressive rant, completely terrified to look at whatever I had just projected behind him. I stepped up to the primary microphone stand, adjusting it smoothly to my height. "You speak so passionately about Meridian Investments, Marcus," I said, my voice amplified and echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You speak about your $500,000 salary and your untouchable status in the financial sector. You speak about moving markets and commanding billions in client assets. But you see, Marcus, the problem with working in the highest echelons of private finance is that the ground beneath your feet can vanish in a matter of seconds." I looked past him out into the sea of guests. I focused specifically on the tables where his corporate colleagues were seated. The senior partners and managing directors of rival firms were squinting at the massive screen. I watched the exact moment comprehension dawned on their faces. I watched their jaws drop. I watched them practically dive into their tuxedo pockets to grab their smartphones. Behind Marcus, a highly confidential internal corporate memorandum was projected in stark black text. The iconic navy blue and silver logo of Meridian Investments sat prominently at the top of the document. Below it, a bold red banner read, "Priority communication to all executive staff and board members." "Since you refuse to look behind you, my dear husband," I offered, my tone dripping with lethal courtesy, "I will do you the honor of reading this aloud for our guests. I want everyone to fully understand the current state of the Coleman family empire." Marcus finally broke. He spun around his expensive dress shoes, slipping slightly on the polished stage floor. He craned his neck, looking up at the 20-foot projection. The harsh white light illuminated the absolute horror washing over his features. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped in a tuxedo. I began to read, my diction sharp and authoritative, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "To all executive staff and board of directors," I read, pacing slowly across the stage. "Please be advised that as of 4:00 p.m. this past Friday, Meridian Investments has been officially acquired. Following a rigorous 4-week forensic audit conducted during the final stages of the acquisition, the new parent company has implemented an immediate restructuring of our senior management team." The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the sharp intakes of breath from the head table. Beatrice was gripping the edge of her chair, her eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. She did not fully understand the corporate jargon, but she understood the tone. She understood that her son's kingdom was under siege. I turned my eyes back to the screen, focusing on the second paragraph. "Effective immediately. Marcus Coleman, Senior Director of Investment Strategy, has been terminated for cause," I announced, letting the words strike the room like physical blows. Marcus let out a strangled, gasping sound. He stumbled backward, gripping his chest, as if he had just taken a bullet to the ribs. He reached a hand out toward the screen, as if he could physically wipe the words away. I did not stop. I raised my voice, ensuring it reached the church ladies sitting in the front row who were now clutching their programs in stunned silence. The termination is the direct result of gross fiduciary negligence and severe violations of corporate compliance. I continued quoting the document verbatim. The forensic audit has uncovered undeniable evidence of insider trading and the deliberate falsification of financial reports designed to artificially inflate client portfolio returns. Mr. Coleman has been locked out of all corporate servers. His building access has been revoked. His corporate accounts have been frozen pending a full investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Marcus dropped to his knees. The impact of his knees hitting the stage echoed through the microphone. He covered his ears, shaking his head back and forth, whispering no over and over again. The titan of industry who had just boasted about his untouchable status was completely shattered. I stepped right to the edge of the stage, looking down at the guests. The investment bankers in the room were staring at the screen in absolute shock. In Washington, D.C., financial circles, being fired is a setback, but being terminated for falsifying returns and insider trading is a death sentence. It is the ultimate taboo. Marcus was not just unemployed. He was entirely radioactive. No reputable firm would ever touch him again. His career was effectively buried under a mountain of federal violations. I looked down at the crumpled form of my husband. "Where is that $500,000 salary now, Marcus?" I asked, my voice quiet, but cutting through the silence with devastating precision. "Where are those performance bonuses you promised your mother? Because according to this internal memorandum, every single dollar of your previous bonuses is currently subject to a corporate clawback provision. The company is going to seize whatever miserable scraps of cash you have left in your checking accounts to cover the damages you caused." I turned my gaze to the head table, finding Beatrice perfectly paralyzed in her seat. "So, Beatrice," I called out, my voice ringing clear across the room, "let us revisit this beautiful $8,000 monthly stipend your son just promised you. I am deeply curious to know how he plans to fund your luxury lifestyle. Will he be paying you out of his unemployment checks? Will he be using the money he steals from his next employer, assuming he does not end up in federal prison first?" Beatrice opened her mouth, trying to formulate a defense, trying to scream at me, but her throat was completely dry. The prestigious matriarch who had spent the entire evening looking down her nose at me was finally choking on her own arrogance. She looked at her son kneeling on the floor, weeping into his hands, and the reality of their destruction finally set in. The Birkin bag, the country club, the luxury cars, and the social status were all gone. They had been erased by a single corporate email projected on a screen for the entire city to see. "You wanted to stand on this stage and use your wealth as a weapon against me," I said, turning back to Marcus. "You wanted to isolate me. You wanted to remind everyone in this room that you held all the power and I held none. But you forgot the most fundamental rule of risk assessment, Marcus. You never expose your liabilities until you are absolutely certain your assets are secure." I looked out over the crowd, watching the faces of the elite society that Marcus had worshipped. They were already distancing themselves. People were leaning away from the stage, averting their eyes. Marcus was no longer a golden boy. He was a cautionary tale. "You are entirely bankrupt, Marcus," I stated, delivering the final verdict. "You are morally, financially, and professionally bankrupt. You do not own a penthouse. You do not have a job. You do not have a salary. You have absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back and a mountain of toxic debt." I stood tall, letting the blinding white light of his termination notice frame my silhouette. I had systematically dismantled the Coleman family legacy and scattered the ashes across the ballroom floor. But the surgical strike was not yet complete. Marcus was destroyed, but there was still one more parasite feeding off the Coleman illusion who needed to be dealt with. I shifted my gaze away from Marcus and locked eyes directly with my brother-in-law, Tyler. The smug, arrogant man who had proudly mocked my prenuptial agreement was about to find out that standing too close to a sinking ship guarantees you will drown with it. Tyler felt the sudden, crushing weight of my attention. He had been sitting stiffly in his gilded chair, but the moment I locked eyes with him, his fight or flight instinct kicked in. Unfortunately for him, he chose to fight. He kicked his chair back so violently it crashed to the polished marble floor, shattering the suffocating silence of the ballroom. "You are out of your mind!" Tyler shouted, his voice echoing with raw, aggressive panic. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face flushing a blotchy, uneven red. "This is a complete fabrication. You hacked into the corporate server or forged this whole presentation just to be vindictive." He took a step away from the table, placing himself between me and the crowd, as if he were physically shielding the Coleman legacy. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the dominant corporate authority he had relied on his entire adult life. "You are a toxic, bitter woman trying to destroy a good man's career because you cannot handle being the lesser partner," Tyler yelled, looking out at the silent audience of politicians and bankers. "Meridian is a fortress. Marcus and I run the most profitable division in that entire company. We manage institutional wealth. We are the backbone of this city's financial sector. You think because you run some boutique real estate firm, you can play God with our lives. Marcus will sue you into oblivion for defamation, Nia. We will bury you in legal fees until you are begging on the street." I did not flinch. I let him scream his desperate macho defense into the cavernous room. I watched him tie himself directly to the mast of a ship that was already resting at the bottom of the ocean. He was so incredibly eager to defend the fraudulent empire he helped build. He was playing the ultimate loyal soldier, trying to protect his mentor while simultaneously reminding the elite crowd that he too was a part of that untouchable corporate brotherhood. "A fake email, Tyler," I asked, my voice smooth and conversational, entirely unfazed by his outburst. "You think I would risk my own corporate standing and invite a massive defamation lawsuit just to forge a termination notice at my own wedding?" I turned my head slightly toward the elevated DJ booth and gave a subtle downward flick of my wrist. The giant projection screen behind me flickered as the document scrolled down exactly 2 paragraphs. "Perhaps you should read the rest of the memorandum before you promise to bury me in legal fees," I suggested, gesturing gracefully toward the 20-foot screen. "Because it seems your definition of a profitable division differs wildly from the legal definition of federal fraud." The text was massive, undeniable, and written in the same sterile, lethal corporate font. I read it aloud, making sure every single syllable struck the far walls of the ballroom with absolute precision. "Furthermore, the forensic audit has identified a network of collusion within the strategy division," I read, my voice ringing with total authority. "Effective immediately. Tyler Evans, mid-level sales director, is hereby terminated for cause. Evidence confirms Mr. Evans acted as a direct co-conspirator in the authorization and distribution of the falsified financial reports." I paused, letting the first wave of devastation hit him before delivering the final blow. "All corporate access is revoked. His corporate accounts are frozen, and his files have been surrendered directly to federal investigators." The blotchy red color vanished from Tyler's face in an instant, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray. His arm, which had been raised to point an accusing finger at me, dropped limply to his side. His mouth hung open, but the aggressive, booming voice he had just used to defend his precious corporate brotherhood completely abandoned him. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark. "You and Marcus were not running the most profitable division," I explained, looking down at him with clinical detachment. "You were running a synchronized fraud ring. You were inflating numbers to trigger your own commission payouts. Did you really think a new acquiring firm would not conduct a deep forensic dive into the ledger? My analysts at Vanguard spotted the discrepancies in your division's portfolios 3 months ago. That is exactly why I leaked the initial tip to the auditing board." The investment bankers in the room let out a collective gasp. I had just casually admitted to orchestrating the downfall of their firm from the shadows. I had weaponized my own company to trigger the audit that destroyed them. Tyler took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the heavy banquet table. His eyes were wide, darting frantically across the massive screen, reading his own professional death sentence over and over again, as if the words might magically rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. You were so loud earlier tonight, Tyler. I reminded him, my voice echoing coldly across the silent room. You were so incredibly eager to mock me. You laughed in my face and told me that Marcus's prenuptial agreement was a masterpiece of legal warfare. You gloated about how I would never touch the Coleman family wealth. You mocked my career and told me to accept my place. I took a slow, deliberate step toward his edge of the stage. But you forgot to secure your own perimeter, Tyler. You spent all your energy protecting Marcus's phantom assets while actively participating in federal financial crimes. You thought marrying into the Coleman family made you untouchable. Now you are just unemployed, disgraced, and facing a very lengthy federal indictment. I held my position on the stage, watching the absolute destruction of the two men who had spent the entire year treating me like an uneducated peasant. They had built their fragile egos on impressive titles and stolen money. They had demanded respect they never earned. Now they were both jobless, humiliated, and facing the very real threat of federal prison. The silence in the room was no longer just shocked. It was apocalyptic. The illusion of family loyalty shattered with the sharp, violent crack of a palm striking a cheek. Camille had been standing perfectly still, her designer gown looking suddenly heavy and restrictive as the reality of my words washed over her. The realization that her sprawling five-bedroom estate was funded by a massive fraud ring that her husband had hidden from her completely short-circuited her mind. She marched around the head table, her high heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She grabbed Tyler by the lapels of his rented tuxedo and slapped him across the face with enough force to send him stumbling backward. "You lied to me!" Camille shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual refined country club polish. "You told me the cash advances were bridge loans from the firm. You told me the landscaping bills and the mortgage were covered by your performance bonuses. You absolute idiot! You dragged my name into a federal crime." Tyler touched his reddened cheek, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the elite guests watched his domestic implosion. "Camille, calm down," he hissed, trying to grab her wrists to stop her from hitting him again. "Not here, Camille. We are in front of the managing directors. We can fix this if we just stay quiet and call a lawyer." "Fix this," Camille screamed, struggling against his grip and pushing him hard in the chest. "There is no fixing a federal indictment, Tyler. You ruined my life. You promised me we were secure, and now you are telling me we are going to lose the house because you and my brother are common thieves. How am I supposed to show my face at the club? How am I supposed to explain this to my friends?" The pure, unadulterated selfishness of her rant was almost poetic. She did not care that her husband had stolen money. She did not care that he had engaged in massive corporate fraud. She only cared that she could no longer afford her aesthetic lifestyle and that her wealthy friends would laugh at her. The supposedly unbreakable bond of the Coleman family was dissolving into a chaotic, ugly street brawl right in the middle of a luxury ballroom. The camera, if it were moving through this scene, would be handheld and shaky, capturing the rapid, frantic breakdown of their unity as they turned on each other like rats trapped on a sinking ship. Tyler finally lost his temper, shoving Camille away from him. "Oh, please," he spat, his own voice rising in volume. "Do not act like you are some innocent victim, Camille. You happily spent every single dollar I brought home. You wanted the cars, you wanted the vacations, and you wanted to look just like your precious mother. You knew my base salary could not cover your spending habits, but you never once asked where the extra cash was coming from as long as your credit cards kept working." They were shouting over each other now, airing their toxic financial secrets for the entire city to hear. The perfect sophisticated facade they had worn for years was completely ripped to shreds. Beatrice watched her daughter and son-in-law tearing each other apart. She looked out at the audience, specifically at the front row where her powerful church friends were seated. Sister Jackson and Sister Miller were not offering sympathetic smiles anymore. They were gathering their silk wraps and evening bags, looking at Beatrice with expressions of profound disgust. The religious community that Beatrice had ruled with an iron fist was actively turning its back on her. She was losing her audience, her respect, and her entire social currency in real time. Beatrice panicked. When a narcissist loses control of the narrative and realizes they can no longer attack their way out of a situation, they instantly play the victim. It is a predictable, pathetic reflex. She clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes rolling back dramatically in her head. She let out a loud theatrical gasp, making sure it carried over the sound of Camille and Tyler arguing. "Oh, Lord," she wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "My heart. The stress of these vicious lies is too much for my heart." With a slow, calculated swoop, Beatrice collapsed forward against the sweetheart table. She made sure not to hit the edge too hard, sending a few silverware pieces clattering to the floor, while draping herself over the white linen, like a tragic heroine in a cheap soap opera. She kept one eye slightly open, waiting for the rush of concerned guests to come to her rescue. She expected the church ladies to run forward with glasses of water. She expected Marcus to rush to her side and beg for medical assistance. Nobody moved. The guests simply stared at her poorly executed performance. They had just seen her son exposed for federal fraud and her daughter admit to living off stolen funds. A fake fainting spell was not going to win back their sympathy. I leaned into the microphone, a dry, amused smile playing on my lips. "Will someone please get Beatrice a glass of tap water?" I asked, my voice echoing with icy indifference. She seems to be suffering from a sudden severe bout of accountability. It can be quite a shock to the system when you experience it for the first time in your life. Do not worry, folks, her vital signs are perfectly fine. It is just her ego that is flatlining. A few genuine laughs erupted from the back of the room, where my vanguard analysts were seated. Beatrice, hearing the laughter, squeezed her eyes shut tighter, refusing to sit up, realizing her performance had failed spectacularly. Marcus could no longer take the pressure. The towering projection of his termination email loomed over him like a tombstone. His mother was faking a medical emergency on a table covered in spilled champagne. His sister and brother-in-law were screaming about predatory loans. His entire universe had been reduced to a humiliating circus. He crawled forward. The man who had demanded my absolute submission just 20 minutes ago literally crawled to the edge of the stage on his hands and knees. He looked up at me, his face a grotesque mask of sweat, tears, and profound desperation. He grabbed the hem of my silk wedding gown, his fingers clutching the fabric like a drowning man holding onto a life raft. "Nia, please!" he begged, his voice a broken, pathetic whisper that the microphone barely caught. "Please, I am begging you. Turn off the screen. Just turn it off. I cannot take this anymore. Everyone is staring at me. You have made your point. You won. I admit it. You won. Just make it stop." He looked so incredibly small. The arrogant corporate titan had been completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified little boy pleading with the woman he had tried to destroy. "I will sign whatever you want." Marcus sobbed, tears dripping from his chin onto the polished floor. "I will move out of the penthouse tonight. I will cancel the stipend to my mother. I will do anything you ask me to do, Nia. Just please turn off that projector and tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them it is a corporate mistake. Please, Nia, I am your husband. Have mercy on me. Have mercy." I looked down at his shaking hands gripping my dress. I did not pull away. I wanted him to hold on to me. I wanted him to feel the exact texture of the woman he had vastly underestimated. He was begging for mercy. He was asking me to spare him the very public execution he had gleefully orchestrated for me. He thought this was the end of the show. He thought exposing his fraudulent career and his fake wealth was the deepest I could cut. But I was not done. The true masterpiece of my retaliation required one final devastating stroke. I reached down and gently placed my hand over his, peeling his sweaty fingers off my wedding gown one by one. I leaned down so my face was only inches from his, meeting his terrified gaze, with eyes as cold and deep as the ocean. "Mercy is for people who make honest mistakes. Marcus," I whispered, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet tone that only he could hear. "You did not make a mistake. You planned to humiliate me. You planned to leave me with absolutely nothing while you gave my money to your mother. You do not get mercy. You get exactly what you earned." I stood back up, gripping the microphone stand. I had broken his pride and his career. Now it was time to address the wedding budget and the final inescapable trap of his precious prenuptial agreement. I turned my back on the pathetic man kneeling on the floor. I stepped off the stage, the heavy silk of my custom gown gliding effortlessly over the polished wood, and began to walk slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom. The guests parted for me instinctively, pulling their chairs in and holding their breath. I moved with absolute fluid grace. Every step I took was measured and serene, projecting the total calm of a woman who had just conquered a kingdom. I left Marcus thrashing in his own panic behind me. My physical dismissal broke whatever fragile thread of sanity he had left. The absolute silence of my departure was more humiliating to him than anything I had said so far. He scrambled back to his feet, his dress shoes slipping frantically against the marble. He snatched the microphone from the stand with shaking hands, desperate to reclaim the narrative, desperate to find any angle that could save him from total social annihilation. "Look at her!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking violently through the state-of-the-art sound system. His breathing was ragged and spit flew from his lips as he pointed a trembling finger at my back. "Look at the ungrateful, calculating woman I just married." He gripped the microphone with both hands, his knuckles turning stark white. He scanned the audience, locking eyes with the investment bankers and the church elders, frantically trying to win back their sympathy. He was attempting to weaponize the oldest, most predictable stereotype in the book. He was trying to paint me as the villain of his story. "She is a gold digger," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "She is a manipulative parasite who used my name and my status to get into this ballroom. She wanted the elite lifestyle. She wanted the access. And now she is trying to destroy me, to take everything I have built." I did not stop walking. I let him shout his desperate accusations to the crowd, allowing him to dig his grave even deeper. "Do you have any idea how much this wedding cost?" Marcus roared, gesturing wildly around the opulent room. $150,000. I paid $150,000 out of my own pocket to give her this fairy tale. Look at the imported white orchids covering every single table. Look at the premium champagne you are all drinking right now. Look at the 5-tier cake and the crystal chandeliers. My money paid for every single bite of food and every drop of liquor in this venue. Beatrice, sensing a brief opportunity to salvage her pride, suddenly found a second wind. She sat up from her slump over the sweetheart table, pointing a shaking hand in my direction. "She took my son's hard-earned money to dress herself up like a queen." Beatrice croaked, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "She is an ungrateful fraud." Marcus fed on his mother's validation, his chest puffing out again as he leaned heavily into the microphone. "I gave her everything." He yelled, his face slick with sweat. "I paid the caterers. I paid the florists. I paid the venue management. I wrote the checks for all of it last week. I did not let her contribute a single dime because I am a provider. I take care of what is mine. And this is how she repays my generosity, by forging termination notices and hacking my company to make me look like a criminal." He was spiraling into total delusion, grasping at anything that could make him look like a martyr. He honestly believed that throwing a massive price tag in the faces of Washington's elite would somehow magically erase the eviction notice sitting on his mother's table and the federal fraud charges hanging over his head. He thought that framing me as a greedy, unappreciative bride would instantly turn the crowd against me. I stopped halfway down the center aisle. I stood dead center in the middle of the ballroom, completely surrounded by the silent, staring guests. I slowly turned around to face the stage. I did not have a microphone anymore, but I did not need one. The acoustics of the massive room carried my voice perfectly, and the crowd was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. $150,000, I repeated, letting the staggering number hang in the heavy air. I looked at the extravagant floral arrangements cascading down the pillars. I looked at the towering cake adorned with edible gold leaf. I looked at the premium champagne glasses resting in the hands of the stunned guests. Then I locked my eyes directly onto Marcus, who was standing on the stage, panting heavily, clutching the microphone like a lifeline. "It is a truly massive amount of money for a single evening, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. "You really spared no expense to create this beautiful illusion. You are absolutely right about the budget. You paid $150,000 in full. You compensated all the vendors up front. You wrote the checks, and you proudly took on the entire financial burden of this spectacular reception. Marcus nodded aggressively, a pathetic glimmer of vindication flashing across his face. He thought he had scored a point. He thought I was finally conceding to his greatness in front of the crowd. "Because I take care of my family," Marcus yelled back into the microphone, trying to sound authoritative, but ultimately just sounding desperate. "Because I am a true success story and you are just an ungrateful liar trying to steal my shine." I let a sharp, cold smile spread slowly across my lips. The absolute foolishness of this man was breathtaking. He had just publicly, loudly, and repeatedly claimed full exclusive ownership of the wedding budget. He had just demanded that everyone in the room acknowledge that he alone handled the $150,000 price tag. "You are very eager to claim ownership of those funds tonight, Marcus," I stated, taking one slow, deliberate step back toward the stage. "You are very eager to boast about writing those checks. But there is a very specific reason you insisted on covering the entire wedding budget yourself. There is a reason you absolutely refused to let me use my own credit cards or contribute a single dollar to the vendor deposits." Marcus faltered. The frantic energy drained out of his body as he watched my expression. His grip on the microphone loosened. He suddenly realized I was not conceding anything. I was simply setting up the final, inescapable trap. "You did not pay for this wedding out of your own pocket because you are a generous provider," I announced, my voice slicing through the ballroom with lethal precision. "You paid for it because you had a massive ticking time bomb on your hands, and you needed to dispose of the evidence before the federal auditors knocked on your door." I reached into the hidden seam of my gown one final time. My fingers brushed against a sharply folded piece of thick stationery. I pulled it out and held it up between my index and middle finger. If a camera were capturing this exact fraction of a second, it would zoom in tight, locking onto my face and the single devastating piece of paper I held in the air. The bright lights illuminated the official watermark stamped clearly at the top right corner. It was a seal that made the blood run cold in the veins of every corrupt financial executive in Washington. It was the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. $150,000. I repeated, my voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling calm. "You did not save that money, Marcus. You did not earn it through brilliant investments or late nights at the office. You did not secure that bag through your sheer corporate genius. You stole it. You embezzled every single cent of this spectacular wedding budget directly from the retirement accounts of your most vulnerable clients." The ballroom descended into a state of absolute paralysis. The wealthy elite guests, who had just been drinking the premium champagne Marcus had boasted about, suddenly looked at their crystal glasses as if they were filled with poison. The church ladies in the front row gasped, pressing their hands to their mouths in sheer horror. "You and Tyler skimmed off the top of municipal pension funds," I explained, ensuring my voice carried to the executives sitting in the back. "You targeted the retirement accounts of public school teachers, city workers, and middle-class families who trusted Meridian to protect their futures. You created dummy accounts and siphoned the returns, slowly thinking the margin of error was too small for the internal compliance team to catch. And you were right. Meridian's compliance team was entirely incompetent. But that stolen money was sitting in those offshore accounts, turning incredibly radioactive. You knew a standard industry audit was eventually coming, and you needed to wash that cash immediately." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the stage, closing the distance between the piece of paper in my hand and Marcus's terrified face. "So you funneled it into our wedding," I stated, my words striking him like a physical barrage. "You rushed the planning. You demanded we use vendors who accepted massive, non-refundable cash deposits. You wired tens of thousands of dollars to offshore floral distributors and untraceable catering shell companies. You laundered your stolen money right in front of Washington society, disguising a desperate federal crime as a fairy tale romance. You did not pay for this wedding to be a generous provider, Marcus. You paid for it because it was the fastest way to scrub $150,000 of dirty money off your ledger." Marcus was completely breathless. He looked as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of his lungs. He looked over at Tyler, who was currently gripping the edge of his table, looking like he was about to physically vomit onto the marble floor. Tyler knew the game was entirely up. Camille was sobbing uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands, rocking back and forth in her chair, as the reality of her husband and brother's federal crimes destroyed her social standing forever. Beatrice was entirely silent, her eyes fixed blindly on the floral arrangements she now knew were paid for with stolen retirement funds. "But how did I know all of this?" I asked, tilting my head slightly and addressing the audience. How could a simple low-level risk advisor possibly gain access to the highly classified, encrypted financial routing numbers of a senior director at Meridian Investments? I lowered the document slightly, holding Marcus's gaze. He was trembling so violently the stage lights caught the tremor in his shoulders. "I told you earlier tonight that Vanguard Holdings buys distressed assets." I said, my tone perfectly conversational, but laced with absolute lethal authority. "I told you we quietly purchase bad debt from desperate individuals. But Vanguard does not just buy residential real estate. We acquire failing corrupt financial institutions and gut them for parts." Vanguard Holdings is the private equity firm that initiated the hostile takeover of Meridian Investments last month. The collective gasp from the investment bankers in the room was audible. Several of the managing directors physically leaned back in their chairs, reeling from the magnitude of the corporate twist. "I am your new parent company, Marcus," I announced, the words ringing out with total, undeniable dominance. "I am the entity that bought your firm. I am the architect of the forensic audit that exposed your entire operation. When my analyst took over Meridian's servers, I personally ordered a deep dive into the senior strategy division. I watched the digital money trail in real time. I watched you and Tyler transfer the stolen funds. I watched you wire the exact amounts to the wedding planners. I watched you orchestrate your own destruction from the comfort of my executive office." Marcus let out a pathetic whimpering sound, shaking his head side to side in total denial. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his reality. He was not just facing a disgruntled bride. He was facing the chief executive officer, who now owned his entire professional existence. "I did not just fire you this afternoon, Marcus," I continued, taking one final step toward the stage. "I compiled a 500-page digital dossier of your and Tyler's illicit transactions. Every single wire transfer, every fake account, every forged signature. I documented it all. And yesterday morning, I personally walked into the Washington field office and handed that entire dossier over to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. I held up the piece of thick stationery again, making sure the federal seal was visible to everyone in the first 3 rows. "This document in my hand is not a wedding vow," I stated, my voice echoing like a final gavel strike. "It is the formal federal acknowledgement of the active arrest warrants for Marcus Coleman and Tyler Evans." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. Marcus stared at the paper in my hand, his eyes wide and unblinking. The arrogant man who had proudly marched onto that stage to publicly humiliate me, to strip me of my dignity, and force me to bow down to his mother, was now completely, utterly erased. He had tried to build a cage for me out of fake wealth and toxic pride, but he had inadvertently walked himself straight into a federal penitentiary. I stood victorious in the center of the ballroom, breathing in the pristine air of my total triumph. I had promised myself I would not shed a single tear today, and I had kept that promise perfectly. I had let them enjoy their champagne. I had let them eat their expensive caviar. I had let them bask in the false glory of the Coleman family legacy right up until the exact moment I decided to pull the floor out from under them. But the true genius of my retaliation, the flawless, unassailable beauty of my revenge, was not just in exposing his crimes. It was in the very document he had used to try and trap me in the first place. I slowly turned my gaze away from the broken man on the stage and looked down at the small beaded clutch resting on my assigned chair at the sweetheart table. Inside that clutch was a copy of the prenuptial agreement. It was time to close the trap completely and ensure that when Marcus drowned, he would not be able to drag me down with him. I walked back to the sweetheart table, my movements unhurried and precise. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating as I reached for my beaded silk clutch resting beside my untouched dinner plate. I snapped the golden clasp open and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. It was several pages thick, printed on high-quality parchment bearing the arrogant, sprawling signature of Marcus Coleman on the final page. I turned back to the stage. If you were standing right behind me looking over my shoulder, you would see the absolute wreckage of a man. Marcus was still on his hands and knees staring blankly at the floor, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, hyperventilating sobs. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, tracing the document in my hand. "Do you recognize this contract, Marcus?" I asked, holding the papers up so the harsh stage lights caught the stark black text. "I brought a copy with me tonight just in case you needed a gentle reminder of the vows we actually took. This is the prenuptial agreement you slid across the table at that upscale steakhouse last Tuesday, the one you demanded I sign to prove I was not a gold digger. The one Tyler laughed about, insisting it was just standard procedure to protect your incredible wealth from my greedy hands." Marcus let out a wretched, guttural sound, burying his face in his hands. He knew. The realization was hitting him with the force of a freight train. "Tyler," I called out, shifting my gaze to my brother-in-law, who was now leaning heavily against a marble pillar, looking as though he might actually vomit. "You were so incredibly proud of this document an hour ago. You called it a masterpiece of legal warfare. You gloated that what is mine, and what is his is his. You bragged to this entire room that I would never be able to touch his investment portfolios or his real estate." I took a slow, deliberate step back toward the stage, my voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute finality. "I want to publicly thank you both for your intense financial paranoia. Because in your desperate, arrogant attempt to box me out of your phantom empire, you dug a trench so deep around your own assets that you completely isolated your liabilities. You see, Marcus, when the federal government freezes your bank accounts tomorrow morning, they are going to demand full restitution for the retirement funds you embezzled," I explained, ensuring every single word was painfully clear to the elite audience watching us. "They are going to fine you millions of dollars in federal penalties. You are going to need a team of elite defense attorneys, and those lawyers charge exorbitant retainers just to walk into a courtroom. Not to mention the $150,000 in wedding vendor debts that are going to bounce the second those fraudulent offshore wire transfers are flagged and reversed by the FBI." Beatrice let out another loud, frantic wail, finally grasping the sheer mathematical reality of her son's ruin. He was going to owe millions of dollars to the federal government, and he had absolutely nothing to pay it with. He was a financial ghost. Under normal marital circumstances, those staggering debts would become my shared burden. I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly through the grand space. "A judge could order the liquidation of my private equity firm to pay for your criminal restitution. The creditors could come after my personal checking accounts. I would spend the next decade drowning in the devastating financial fallout of your catastrophic greed." I unfolded the prenuptial agreement and read directly from Clause 4, the exact clause Marcus had highlighted with his expensive pen at the restaurant. "Neither party shall be held responsible for any debts, liabilities, legal judgments, or financial obligations incurred by the other party prior to or during the marriage. All such obligations remain the sole and exclusive responsibility of the incurring individual." I lowered the paper, staring down at my broken husband. "You built your own cage, Marcus. You welded the iron bars shut and threw away the key because you were terrified I might ask you to buy my groceries. You ensured that my $40 million net worth is absolutely legally untouchable. The federal government cannot touch it. The angry wedding caterers and florists cannot touch it. And you cannot touch a single dime of my money to pay for your criminal defense attorneys." Marcus looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute agony. He reached a shaking hand out toward me again, his fingers grasping at the empty air between us. "Nia, please," he whimpered, his voice barely recognizable, stripped of all its commanding baritone. "I am your husband. You have to help me. I will go to federal prison. They will destroy my life. You have the money to fix this. please, I will do anything. I looked down at him with profound, unyielding indifference. I am just a risk advisor, Marcus, I replied, echoing the exact insult his mother had used to belittle me all year. And my professional assessment is that you are a highly toxic liability. I do not bail out bad investments, and I certainly do not finance federal criminals who try to humiliate me in front of my own family. I dropped the prenuptial agreement. The thick parchment papers fluttered through the air, drifting down slowly until they landed right on the polished floor directly in front of his knees. It was the ultimate inescapable sentence. He had spent his entire life trying to project total dominance, but in the end, his own vanity was the weapon that ensured his complete and utter devastation. The papers settled onto the marble floor. Before Marcus could even reach out with a trembling hand to touch the contract he had so proudly engineered, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing through the cool night air of the Capitol. Within seconds, the high-pitched shriek multiplied and grew louder, rapidly approaching the grand entrance of our exclusive venue. The elite guests standing frozen around the perimeter of the dance floor turned their heads toward the massive arched windows. The romantic ambient lighting of the reception was instantly swallowed by a violent, chaotic strobe. Flashing red and blue lights pierced through the intricate stained glass windows, casting jagged, frantic shadows across the white linen tables and the towering floral arrangements. The colors washed over the terrified faces of the Coleman family, painting them in the harsh, undeniable glow of federal law enforcement. The sirens reached a deafening crescendo right outside the front doors before abruptly cutting off, leaving only the heavy, pulsing rotation of the police lights to illuminate the room. Tyler scrambled backward away from the head table, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the spilled champagne. He looked frantically toward the emergency exits, but he was entirely boxed in by the crowd of investment bankers, who were now actively forming a physical barricade to distance themselves from him. Nobody in Washington protects a sinking ship. The executives who had toasted Tyler an hour ago now looked at him with absolute disgusted detachment. The towering mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. A team of federal agents stepped into the venue. They did not wear tactical gear, but their sharp dark suits and the unmistakable gold badges clipped to their belts communicated absolute, unquestionable authority. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency, parting the sea of socialites and politicians without uttering a single "excuse me." 2 uniformed police officers flanked them, securing the exits. Marcus Coleman and Tyler Evans, the lead agent, announced his voice, a booming baritone that required no microphone to command the room. "We have federal warrants for your arrest regarding charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud." Beatrice witnessed the federal agents marching down the center aisle and experienced a miraculous, instantaneous recovery. The theatrical swoon she had been performing on the sweetheart table evaporated. The dying matriarch routine was entirely abandoned. She shot up from her chair, knocking over a centerpiece of white orchids, and scrambled around the table with the frantic energy of a desperate woman. She did not run to the agents. She ran directly to me. Beatrice grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into my bare skin. The aristocratic pride she had wielded like a weapon all evening was completely gone. She was hyperventilating, her designer makeup running down her face in dark, jagged streaks. "Nia, please," Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking as she shook my arm. "Nia, you have to stop this. You have $40 million. You said you have $40 million. Pay them. Pay whatever the bond is. Hire the best lawyers in the city. You cannot let them take my son away in handcuffs. He is your husband. You have to save him." I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. I did not pull away immediately. I let her hold on to me, letting the entire room witness the mighty Beatrice Coleman begging for salvation from the very woman she had spent the last 12 months calling a low-level peasant. She was openly weeping now, pleading for access to the exact wealth she had tried so hard to mock. I reached down and calmly detached her fingers from my arm. I smoothed the silk of my gown where she had wrinkled it. "I am so sorry, Mother Beatrice," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. But my credit cards are strictly blocked for the Coleman family. I believe we established earlier tonight that your son already maxed out my generosity when he bought that fake symbol of wealth sitting on your table. And according to Marcus, I am just a risk advisor. I certainly do not have the clearance to interfere with a federal investigation. But you have the money, she wailed, falling to her knees beside Marcus, who was still paralyzed on the floor. You have the power. You bought his company. You can make this go away. I do not make bad investments go away, Beatrice, I stated, looking down at the two of them. I liquidate them. Your son is no longer a viable asset. He is a liability, and I am simply balancing my books. The federal agents reached the edge of the stage. They did not care about the custom-tailored tuxedos or the expensive boutonnieres pinned to their lapels. Two agents grabbed Marcus by the arms, hauling him up from the marble floor without an ounce of gentleness. Marcus offered no resistance. He was completely catatonic, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing as they spun him around and pulled his arms behind his back. The metallic ratcheting click of the handcuffs snapping shut over his wrists echoed loudly over the sound system because the microphone was still lying on the floor nearby. It was the sharpest, most definitive sound of the entire evening. It was the sound of a grand illusion being permanently locked away in a steel cage. Across the room, Tyler was putting up a fight. He tried to pull his arm away from the agent, arresting him, shouting frantic, disjointed threats about calling his lawyers and suing the government for harassment. But his corporate bravado meant absolutely nothing to the federal authorities. An agent firmly swept Tyler's legs out from under him, dropping him hard onto the polished floor. Camille screamed, covering her face, as her husband was forcibly restrained and handcuffed right in front of her country club friends. Tyler's nose was bleeding slightly where it had hit the floor, staining his pristine white dress shirt. You have the right to remain silent. The lead agent recited his voice, carrying a bored routine cadence that made the moment feel even more degrading. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The Miranda warning washed over the elite audience, a stark reminder that no amount of stolen wealth could insulate these men from the consequences of their arrogance. The agents pulled Marcus and Tyler forward, marching them back down the center aisle. It was the exact same path I had walked just moments earlier, but their journey was a parade of absolute humiliation. Marcus stumbled, his head hanging low. He did not look at his mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the stage. He did not look at his colleagues, who were actively turning their backs to avoid being photographed anywhere near him. And he did not look at me. The golden boy of Washington High society was being paraded through his own $150,000 wedding reception in federal restraints. The red and blue lights from the police cruisers flashed frantically against their faces as the heavy mahogany doors were pushed open to the cool night air. The flashes of cameras from outside indicated that the press had already caught wind of the high-profile raid. Marcus and Tyler were shoved into the back of separate waiting vehicles, the doors slamming shut with a heavy, decisive thud that finalized their removal from my life. The sirens flared to life once again, piercing the silence of the night as the convoy of federal vehicles pulled away from the grand estate. I stood perfectly still on the stage, watching the flashing lights fade away into the distance, until there was nothing left but the soft, ambient glow of the chandeliers illuminating the ruined remnants of the Coleman family. The flashing red and blue lights eventually faded into the distance, leaving the grand ballroom in a state of stunned exhaustion. I did not stay to watch the caterers clean up the shattered glass or listen to the panicked whispers of the remaining guests. I simply turned around, gathered the train of my custom silk gown, and walked out the front doors into the cool night air. A black town car was already waiting for me at the curb with the engine running and the door held open by a driver who asked absolutely zero questions. I slid into the back seat, leaving the entire chaotic mess exactly where it belonged in the past. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my vintage Cabernet, bringing us back to the present moment. The chaos of that night feels like a lifetime ago, though it has only been 18 months. I sink deeper into the plush velvet of my sofa, letting the absolute pristine silence of my living room wash over me. If you were watching me right now, you would see the camera slowly pulling back, a smooth, creeping dolly out, that captures the sheer scale of the sanctuary I have built for myself. There is no shouting here. There is no arrogant man demanding my submission, and no bitter matriarch inspecting my flaws. There is only the undeniable peace that comes from total financial and emotional autonomy. You are probably wondering how long the divorce proceedings took. You are probably imagining the grueling months of depositions, the vicious mediations over asset division, and the endless legal fees required to untangle myself from a man who was facing federal prosecution. It is a logical assumption. When a marriage explodes that spectacularly, the blast radius usually catches both people. But I am a risk advisor and a private equity chief executive. I do not leave loose ends, and I absolutely never expose myself to prolonged legal liabilities. There were no divorce proceedings. There were no mediations. There was no division of assets because legally there was no marriage. The morning of the wedding, while Marcus was busy rehearsing his self-congratulatory speech and Tyler was drinking scotch in the groom's suite, we signed the official marriage license in front of the officiant. It is a standard procedure. The officiant signs it, the witnesses sign it, and then someone is tasked with physically mailing the document to the Washington District of Columbia Courthouse to be recorded into the official legal registry. Marcus, being the incredibly important and busy corporate titan that he was, casually delegated that administrative task to me. He handed me the envelope, told me to drop it in the mail, and walked away to take photos. I did take the envelope, but I did not walk to a mailbox. I walked directly into the bridal suite, fed the marriage license into a heavy-duty cross-cut shredder, and watched it turn into a pile of illegible confetti. A wedding without a filed marriage license is not a legally binding union. It is just an incredibly expensive catered party where people wear fancy clothes and eat cake. Marcus forced me to sign a ruthless, ironclad prenuptial agreement to protect his assets from a marriage that fundamentally did not exist in the eyes of the law. He spent $150,000 of stolen money to throw a theatrical performance, and I was merely a guest star who walked off the stage when the curtain dropped. When the federal prosecutors inevitably looked into his marital status to see if they could seize spousal assets, they found absolutely nothing tying me to Marcus Coleman. I was a ghost. The fallout for the Coleman family was as swift and merciless as the market itself. Marcus is currently residing in a federal correctional institution, serving a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years for wire fraud and embezzlement. He wears a standard-issue jumpsuit, now a far cry from the custom-tailored tuxedos he used to demand. There are no corner offices in federal prison. There is no stage for him to stand on and demand applause. He is just another inmate, stripped of his title, his wealth, and his inflated ego. Tyler and Camille did not survive the financial collapse. The moment Tyler was indicted, Camille filed for divorce, desperate to distance herself from his crimes. But she could not distance herself from the crushing debt they had accumulated together. Their sprawling 5-bedroom estate was foreclosed upon. The luxury cars were repossessed in the middle of the night. Camille, who had spent her entire adult life mocking working-class people, was forced to take a minimum-wage retail job just to afford a studio apartment. Tyler is serving 3 years in a lower-security facility, spending his days regretting the moment he ever decided to ride his brother-in-law's coattails. And Beatrice, the proud, haughty matriarch who believed she was royalty, experienced the most poetic downfall of them all. With Marcus in prison and his assets seized by the federal government to pay restitution, her lifestyle evaporated overnight. The megachurch that she had treated like her personal kingdom formally asked her to step down from the Elders' Council, citing the public scandal. Sister Jackson and Sister Miller completely cut ties, refusing to answer her calls. Stripped of her fraudulent prestige and completely bankrupt, Beatrice was forced to move into a subsidized housing complex on the outskirts of the city. There are no imported marble floors there. There are no private elevators. She sits in a tiny government-funded living room, clutching her worthless memories of a dynasty that never actually existed. I look out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my own penthouse, watching the city lights of Washington glittering against the night sky. The camera continues its slow, steady pull back, framing me as a solitary, untouchable figure surrounded by original artwork and modern luxury. We are conditioned from a very young age to shrink ourselves. Society tells women to be accommodating, to be the quiet support system behind a powerful man, to swallow disrespect in the name of family loyalty, and to accept whatever crumbs of affection are thrown our way. We are taught that walking away makes us the villain and that standing up for ourselves makes us difficult. But let me tell you the absolute truth. Your worth is not determined by how much abuse you can endure with a smile. Your value is not measured by your ability to prop up the fragile ego of an arrogant partner or a toxic mother-in-law. Financial independence is the ultimate shield. It is the armor that allows you to walk into any room and know that you do not owe anyone your submission. When you build your own wealth, when you control your own resources, you control your own destiny. You never have to compromise your peace for a roof over your head. You never have to tolerate disrespect because someone else is paying the bills. Do not ever let anyone make you believe you have to pay a toll to sit at their table. Do not let them demand your silence as the price of admission to their family. If they hand you a bill for their basic respect, you look them dead in the eye and you decline the charge. If they refuse to give you a seat at their table, you do not beg for a chair. You do not shrink yourself to fit into their narrow, arrogant spaces. You walk away, you build your own table, you buy the entire building, and you serve them the eviction notice. I take one last sip of my wine, the rich, dark vintage tasting like absolute victory. The camera slowly fades to black, leaving only the resonance of my voice in the quiet room. Build your empire, protect your peace, and never ever apologize for destroying the cages they try to build around you.